All right, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Alain Anello from Legal Impact for Chickens. Alain, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me. Legal Impact for Chickens, of course, is one of the effective animal charities that we give to on Vegan 2.0. And I'm really interested for us all to hear more about what you guys do. So, I'll leave it at that and you can have at it.
Thank you so much for donating to us. We really, really appreciate it. And I guess I'll tell everyone what we do. So Legal Impact for Chickens is a litigation nonprofit. We sue companies and executives that abuse animals on factory farms.
Wow. Okay, that's a really noble cause and seems like an impossibly broad remit. I can't imagine what's involved in doing that.
Yeah, so it is broad. We try to narrow it as much as we can to the work that we think would be the most important for animal welfare. And so we focus specifically on, first of all, it's narrowed to the US. We only do litigation in the US, at least for now. And we focus specifically on extreme mistreatment of animals in agriculture. So things that we see and we think this is particularly bad, it's really concerning, such as we have a lawsuit about chicks being just driven over with vehicles and workers telling each other, oh yeah, it's fine, just drive them over. We have a lawsuit about a company that's putting salt in cows' eyes for no reason, no good reason. So we focus on the worst of the worst behaviors. And we focus on situations where there's a legal case that if we win, it would improve animal welfare. So there's a lot of people who are nobly looking for ways to bring lawsuits to fight pollution or mistreatment of workers in the food industry. But we specifically only bring cases where the cause of action has something to do with the welfare of animals, even though it might include other issues too, but animal welfare is always part of it if we're going to get involved.
That's so interesting. Okay, I have so many sprawling questions in different directions now I want to ask you about. First of all, I have to ask about the salt in the eyes thing. What is going on there? Is there ostensibly some purpose to that, or just no?
So, well, we are in the process of suing a California dairy called Alexander Family Farm. We're very excited that a court ruled that we are, that as a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, Legal Impact for Chickens has the power to enforce California's cruelty law and to move forward with this lawsuit. And in this lawsuit, it's basically a farm that they're doing things their own way, and sometimes doing it their own way even when that is harming animals. So when unfortunately it's common in the dairy industry for animals to get cancer in their eye, and it's called cancer eye, and that's obviously would be extremely expensive to treat. As you know, treating a human for cancer is extremely expensive. So the most normal thing to do would be to euthanize an animal who has cancer in their eye, because they're not going to be able to be slaughtered for meat. But this company wants to save money, so they don't want to euthanize the animals that have cancer in their eye. They want to sell the animals to somebody ostensibly as animals that could be slaughtered, despite the fact that the animals are not going to be able to be slaughtered. And so I guess they have this idea that putting salt in the eye is some sort of a folk remedy for cancer, but obviously that doesn't work. If salt could cure cancer, that would be so cool. And it's not the case, right. And it just hurts.
Wow, that is pretty dreadful. And so is it the case then that there's sort of several players in the supply chain, and they're going to essentially sort of try and get away with selling them to the finishing lot, and then it's their problem sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. This is our allegations in the complaint. We are hoping to move forward to discovery, where we get more answers. And actually, make the defendant sit down in a chair and explain to us what's going on, and actually get to visit the farm ourselves and have really find out everything. But at this stage, based on what we've heard from people who have more information about it than us, yeah, it seems like the plan is sell the cows to somebody else, and that other person will then have to deal with the fact that the cows have cancer after already paying for the cow. They're sold at auction, so it's kind of a quick process to decide if you want to buy an animal or not.
I see. And that is, I see. One thing that makes me think of is the one legal case in American history of animal welfare, which, well, I guess one that I know of, I don't know if it's the only one, that successfully shut down a meat-producing company, which was this thing with the lame cows, where they were entering the meat supply and they weren't supposed to be. And the interesting thing to me about that was the footage was captured, I believe, by animal welfare people, investigators, as an example of animal abuse that would be, used in advocacy materials and so on. And I guess that they didn't necessarily know as they were doing that this was in fact like a legal violation, because it was a food safety issue. So they thought they were documenting animal cruelty, which they were, but they were also documenting food safety violations. Sounds like a similar thing with the eye cancer thing.
It could be if the cows end up being used for meat. We're not alleging that. I'm imagining that whoever buys them will quickly realize they have cancer and will have to euthanize them and just take a loss. That's what I'm assuming would happen, but I don't know. So I'm speculating now. I don't know what ends up happening to those cows. But yeah, if they were used for meat, then that would be an issue with food safety. And you talking about investigations you kind of hit on one of my favorite topics, which is undercover investigations. I think it's really important to get as much information as we can about what happens in factory farms and slaughterhouses and in animal agriculture generally, and to get as much video footage as possible. And so I think undercover investigations are really wonderful and really important, and they're a really useful tool for litigation. So a lot of our work is based on undercover investigations. Our first lawsuit ever was representing Costco shareholders in a shareholder derivative case about the treatment of Costco's chickens, and that was based on a Mercy for Animals undercover investigation. And our second lawsuit was, or is still ongoing, suing a company called Case Farms based on an Animal Outlook undercover investigation that showed cruelty. So we're very into undercover investigations, and I want to promote them to your listeners. I think a lot of people in the animal movement know about undercover investigations for the reason you said, which is that they can be used to educate the public about what's going on in agriculture. And then I think some people feel like, well, we already kind of know what's going on in agriculture. We don't need them anymore. And I want to say, I don't have a lot of expertise about educating the public, so I'm not commenting on that part of it, but they're really important for law, because companies are required to follow the law, and there's often not anyone really recording what they're doing. And so if we record what they're doing, then we can use it to make sure that the companies follow the law.
That is so interesting, because I've thought about this before, where there's an awful lot of effort and emotional investment that goes into doing these undercover investigations. I mean, I've never been on a factory farm myself, but I've seen the footage and everything. I can only imagine it's terrible for the people who sign up to do that, specifically because they like animals and love animals and care about animals and so on, and now they're kind of so close to the cruelty up front. That's such an interesting point, though, because absolutely, there's something in the news in the UK at the moment about pigs being abused on factory farms, and undercover investigators have found this, and now it's in the newspapers, and they're trying to generate attention that way, and that's kind of the theory of change, I suppose. But with an eye to this institutional change versus individual change distinction, undercover investigators might be better off gearing their investigations towards basically like getting footage that would be useful for a legal case, as opposed to getting footage to be useful for a newspaper. I mean, I suppose you could do both, but are there any particular things that you would sort of brief an investigator to look for these things in particular that would be, evidence of violations? I suppose a lot depends on the context, right? But
well, I don't really speak a lot to undercover investigators, but when you said that, I'm imagining myself an opportunity to speak to all the undercover investigators in the world. I think one thing I would love is to ask the organizations that do the investigations to think if there's a way they can be really proud of the way you do it and plan ahead of time for the world to see the way that you did the investigation. Because if we want to use an investigation in a legal case, we want to be able to have the investigator testify and explain to the world how the investigation went down. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be a cool thing to think about, is like, this investigation, for it to be maximally useful, I want to be comfortable talking about it. I want to get ready to be comfortable talking about it. I realize that's difficult because a lot of companies don't want to be investigated. And so if they know how the investigation is going to happen, then they will prevent it. So I'm sure what I'm saying is much easier said than done. But I think that to the extent somebody doing an investigation can think this might be used in a legal proceeding and I want to be ready for that, that's a really cool thought. And then providing evidence of violations, I have no idea. I know that a lot of evidence of violations do come out from undercover investigations, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not the person to speak on that.
Okay, fair enough. So when you were talking about interacting in a way to anticipate that it'll be an illegal case, you're talking about behaving yourself in the course of the investigation, right? I mean, I've spoken to activists who go onto farms, uninvited at nighttime, and they take very seriously biosecurity. They do wear the blue suits and all this kind of stuff because they say, well, we need to show that we've done it properly and not violated, right? Not cause violations like that. I guess it's a little bit of a different thing if you're undercover employed. You can't turn up in your biohazard suit. But yeah, I guess there's got to be. You want to be not documenting yourself doing any violations of health and safety things or anything like that, I guess, is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can. I guess what I would say would be really good is if you work with a lawyer or consult a lawyer ahead of time to find out what are the laws, because sometimes the laws are really not intuitive. In the US, every state has its own decision about how recording works. So in some states, you're allowed to record anyone you want as long as you're part of the conversation, record their voice. And that's called a one-party consent state. In some states, you're only allowed to record someone's voice if every single person in the conversation consents. So that's called a two-party consent state. And that's not something that people are born knowing. There's no inherent. You wouldn't think I'm a bad person for recording someone's voice without their permission, especially if you grew up in a state where that's lawful. And so I think it's not always a matter of following your morals that so much as finding out what the law is and then following them, because there might be random things that you wouldn't think of as being wrong, but that in the particular state you're in are against the rules. And so I don't want investigators to get in trouble for anything. So I would say if you do work with a lawyer, that's really cool to try to have it be planned. I will be ready to be proud of what I've done and to talk about it publicly, and I have nothing to fear, I think is cool. Yeah,
that's that one party, two party state consent state thing is a really good example of the kind of technicality where, like you say, it's not necessarily, you wouldn't think I'm behaving immorally by doing this, but I guess that it wouldn't be admissible in court if you have audio recording from a state where you're not allowed to do it.
It would still be admissible
okay.
As long as you're not a police officer. So I'm sorry if some of your listeners are outside of the US, because I don't know how it works in any other country, but in the US, in a criminal case, police officers, the government can't use information that the government obtained in violation of the criminal defendant's constitutional rights. And so if the government did something illegal to get the evidence, then they can't use it to put the person in prison. But that's not an issue in a civil case, especially when the evidence wasn't collected by the government or wasn't even connected by the plaintiff. So there's nothing to stop us from using evidence of cruelty, even if, regardless of how the evidence was collected. I'm more just saying, I don't want bad things to happen to activists. I don't want them to get in trouble. So I'm more just saying that. And I think investigators are more likely to want to work with lawyers on litigation if they feel good about the way they did the investigation, so that they're not worried about these things. So we can use the evidence. There's not much limitation in most U.S. states on what evidence you can use. I think there are some states that are trying to specifically attack this issue by limiting the use of evidence that was collected on a farm. Like it's a form of ag gag law.
That's
so
something I wanted to ask you about.
That can exist in maybe one. I don't know the status of that, how many states that exists in, or whether that's been upheld as constitutional. But the general rule in the U.S. is like, in a civil case, generally you can use whatever evidence is available to get. The goal is just to get to the truth of what really happened. But I think people who are collecting evidence should still learn the law and try to follow the law, because if you're trying to help animals, I want your life to be good, and I don't want you to have anything negative that could happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And ag gag laws are another really good thing that you mentioned. So I believe that all ag gag laws are probably unconstitutional, but I know that a lot of courts have struck down a lot of them, but some of them haven't been struck down. And so if you did want to do an investigation, it would be really smart to find out what ag gag laws might apply and make sure you're not violating any that haven't been struck down. And I guess that's another reason to just work with a lawyer and have the lawyer figure it all out, so you don't need to be stressing about this stuff.
Interesting. Okay, so ag gag laws, I guess, is a pretty umbrella term for a bunch of specific laws within states that try to govern this kind of thing. I've heard it said that a lot of these laws are sort of on the books but wouldn't be able to be enforced because it becomes a First Amendment issue. Is that the case?
Yeah. That's what. So not only on the books but wouldn't be able to be enforced, but a lot of courts have said that the laws are invalid. And maybe, I think your listeners know what ag gag laws are, but just in case, I'll say it's a pejorative term by people who do not like these laws, and I'm one of those people. But it's basically a law that some U.S. states have passed to try to make it illegal to do undercover investigations in agriculture. And their basic logic is, instead of punishing people who abuse animals, what if we just punish people who talk about the animal abuse? Which I think is never a good solution to a societal problem.
Indeed.
And a lot of courts have said that these laws are unconstitutional because they violate the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment freedom of speech. Because the point of the law is to stop people from communicating about what's happening in agriculture. But I think there might be some laws that are still on the books that haven't actually had a court say they're unconstitutional. And so that it would be a risk to violate that law when you don't know for sure how a court is ultimately going to rule, or if a court has already ruled that it's okay, and you would need to be pinning your hope on getting that court ruling overturned. So I don't want to go so far as to say that the laws are valid, but it might be wise to be cautious about them. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, presumably the devil's in the detail, depending on the law and depending on the state and so on, but maybe not if it's a First Amendment thing. I mean, this is not legal advice, right? But in general, it's taken then that ag gag laws are not constitutional.
That's my general feeling on it. But what you said is kind of the argument that saying the devil's in the details, I feel like that's more of the perspective that the people who support ag gag laws would have, is basically every time a state passes an ag gag law, they will word it slightly differently. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the state can argue this one is okay.
Right.
And then there has to be a whole argument about it. And in my mind, the overall goal of these laws is not an okay goal. And so it shouldn't matter like what tricky wording you're using to get around the fact that you are trying to outlaw talking about something. But that's my take. And if you are thinking of doing an investigation, I would say to just find out about this or get a lawyer to find out about it for you, and then just feel covered.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so part of that comes down to another thing which I wanted to talk about, which I guess is involved in a lot of the strategy of what you do in terms of setting precedents. When you set a precedent that a certain ag law is not constitutional, or you set a precedent that a certain law must be followed, or companies have been penalised for not doing this in the past, I guess that's a pretty big leverage point potentially. How does that kind of play into any area of your strategy? Are there like particular states or particular kind of points in the supply chain that you focus on?
So broadly, what I would say is our goal is to protect animals from cruelty and improve animal welfare. And our goal is not to like punish anyone or make anyone upset or make anyone's life hard. And so the ideal scenario would be that every company and every executive that uses animals in the US looks up the animal cruelty law and then stops and questions, is my behavior compliant with this law? And that is basically the goal we're trying to get to. So in our ideal scenario, it wouldn't be that every single person needs to get caught abusing animals and be punished. Mm-hmm. It would be that people are just aware that these laws apply to them and that people are complying with them proactively. So, so when we bring a case, we want news to get out about the threat case. And our goal is that other meat industry or egg industry executives who read about the case will think, oh, let me look into what's happening in my company and make sure we're complying with the law. And when we win a case, again, the goal is to send that message that you should check how you're treating animals, make sure it complies with the law. And ideally, I think, people should be already complying in theory with every law that's on the books. But I think that because these laws are hardly ever talked about in context of agriculture, I think people kind of forget about them. And we're trying to remind people that it is illegal to abuse or neglect an animal, even if you're doing it to make food.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's basically just about having a mechanism for enforcing the existing laws, which I guess doesn't happen by default, right? A lot of these are civil cases, you versus some producer. It wouldn't happen if there wasn't an organization of lawyers making it happen, right?
Yes, unfortunately, I've never heard, so I think it's very rare to the point where I've never really heard of law enforcement officials coming into factory farms to check whether the animal cruelty law is being complied with. I'm sure it must have happened at some point, but that's not something that I ever hear about. It really seems like when word of animal cruelty gets out, it's either from undercover investigators or just from regular employees that were hired because they wanted to make money. They weren't trying to do an investigation, and then they saw something and were so upset about it, or contract growers who I also consider to be employees, but they're people who raise chickens for big companies, and often the companies will say that these people are not employees, even though they're treated the way an employee would be treated. Word of cruelty getting out is usually from either investigators or people in the industry speaking up themselves. I haven't heard a lot about law enforcement going in to find out. And then when word does get out, it's often animal groups that tell law enforcement about it. And in addition to sending out a press release, the animal groups will send a letter to prosecutors. And for instance, we commissioned an undercover investigation of a California chicken company called Foster Farms that found really horrific things, like workers repeatedly driving chickens over with forklifts. And the organization that we commissioned to do it, Animal Outlook, then sent a letter to prosecutors saying, this stuff is illegal. Like, here's the statute. Here's what happened. You should prosecute. And then last we've heard, prosecutors announced in the news that they're looking into it. So we'll see what happens. But I think that the meat and egg industry has a lot of money and a lot of political power. and a lot of people in law enforcement aren't used to holding companies accountable. They're more used to going after individuals who are a little bit less scary to go after. And so it's really important to use civil litigation to hold companies accountable for cruelty, and to continue to work with police and prosecutors to help them in any way that they can to feel more comfortable to going after big, scary opponents.
I see, yeah, that comes down to being like a calculated risk for the prosecutors in each state, whether they want to pick that fight. And that's where, again, the precedents become so important, right? Because if they can say, oh, Legal Impact for Chickens picked this fight in the state over and they won, so that's an important thing to get on the radar as well. One thing which I want to ask you more about, you said that you prosecute companies and executives. So are the individuals liable for this in some cases?
Yes. If you are an executive at a corporation, like if you're a board, if you're an executive or a board member of a corporation, so you're like the CEO or you're a director or something of a corporation, you owe fiduciary duties to your corporation. And these are, they're best known for the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. So you might have heard people talk about how an executive of a corporation has a duty of care to not waste the corporation's assets accidentally, and a duty of loyalty to not like take the corporation's assets for their own interest or take opportunities from the corporation for themselves. But executives of corporations, at least in the US, and I think in England probably too, also have a fiduciary duty to act lawfully, which is to not make the company break the law. And the logic behind this is that corporations were invented by law. They're a creature of law. They don't exist in nature. So they are only interested in following the law. If two people start just selling lemonade together, they might become a partnership kind of by accident without meaning to be a partnership. But they are not going to become a corporation unless they send articles of incorporation to the government, and the government, in the US, it would be the state government, writes back, like stamping them saying, yes, you are an official corporation. And when you become a corporation, you get special powers like limited liability. So let's say two people sell tainted lemonade, those two people might be in trouble. But if a corporation sells tainted lemonade, the individual people who set up the corporation might be protected. And that's something that the government is doing to be nice and helpful. And so in exchange, the government gets to say, this corporation only exists for lawful purposes. So you can make a lemonade selling corporation, but you can't make a heroin selling corporation.
Right.
If people are selling heroin together, they're not a corporation. And so because corporations have this inherent interest in following the law, one of the ways that an executive could harm a corporation is by making it break the law. So imagine you're an executive of a lemonade company. You shouldn't lose all the money. You shouldn't start your own lemonade stand to compete with the company, because that would be disloyal. But you also shouldn't switch to selling heroin. And you might be thinking, but we can make so much more money by selling heroin than lemonade. True, but it's illegal. And your company has an interest in following the law because it's a corporation. So in our first lawsuit ever, it was called Smith versus Vacris. And it was a shareholder derivative lawsuit where we represented two Costco shareholders who were suing on behalf of Costco to protect Costco's interest in following the law. And they sued Costco's executives and board members saying, we believe the way that you're treating chickens is a crime. It's illegal under the livestock neglect law of the state where you're doing it in. And we want you to stop for the good of Costco.
So it's okay, that's so interesting. So in the case of suing the individuals, the liability is to the company, to the shareholders.
Yeah.
That's the Costco shareholders saying, you're going to lose us money if you break the law.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Okay, so that's how it works then. The individual executives, when their company is violating the law, they are responsible for having their company not violate the law, and therefore they are civilly liable to their company, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. Damn, that's so interesting. Okay. Um, yeah, do you have something else on that?
Oh yeah, there's an example I like to give of this that is the one that I personally learned about in law school. So it's, I guess, maybe the best known example in the U.S., which had to do with AT&T. So AT&T um, gave it did a lot of work, like telecommunications work, for the Democratic National Committee. And for anyone who doesn't know, AT&T is a giant telephone and internet company, and the Democratic National Committee is like a partisan political group in the United States. And so AT&T did all this work for them. And then when it came time for the company, so the DNC to pay AT&T back, AT&T allegedly, according to the complaint, was just like, nah, you don't have to pay us back. You can keep the money. And so some shareholders were upset. They were like, why are you giving all this free stuff to the Democrats? And I guess the defense would have been that we're not wasting the company's money. It's actually good to give free stuff to the Democrats because they're very powerful. And if the Democrats are in power in our country, then maybe they'll do AT&T favors, you know, like I'm kind of adding color here. I don't know exactly what AT&T was thinking, but maybe AT&T allegedly could have been thinking, oh, we'll be allowed to do mergers or acquisitions we wouldn't have been allowed to do because we're so nice to the Democrats. And so it would have been a smart business move. Mergers, yeah. MERGERS. So anyways, I'm not saying that was actually what AT&T had in mind, but the complaint alleged that AT&T was doing this in a way that basically was giving an improper benefit to a political party that could theoretically result in like a purely financial benefit back to AT&T later, sort of like a bribe. And this allegedly was in violation of campaign finance laws that existed at the time. And so the shareholders said, even if it's like a good business move in some weirdly like sociopathic sense to do favors for somebody who's in power, it's a crime, or I don't know if it's a crime or some other kind of civil violation, but it's illegal.
Either one crime or the other, basically, wasn't it? Their defense against not having wasted the company's resources was that they were breaking some other law. Yeah,
exactly. So they're like, you're not allowed to break laws, and the company does not want to break laws. You can't say that AT&T wants to break the law. And so it went up to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Third Circuit said, like, yeah, that's a valid argument. AT&T wouldn't want to break a law. And if a human is making AT&T break the law, then the human is hurting AT&T. And that's not in accordance with the fiduciary duty that executives owe to AT&T.
That's so interesting. There's a lot going on there. That's, yeah, there's, okay, a lot of moving parts there, yeah. One other thing that just sort of piqued my interest, on a previous topic we were speaking about this issue of the contract growers. They are classified as such, I imagine, so that they're not entitled to receive some employee benefits or something like that. Is that the reason why they're?
Yeah. So in the U.S., there's federal laws protecting employees, and maybe every state also has additional laws protecting employees. And they say things like if an employee has to make at least minimum wage. So there's a minimum amount you can pay someone per hour. And then they also say employees who work more than a certain amount, I think like 40 hours per week, are legally required to get overtime pay, which has to be time and a half. So whatever their normal hourly rate is, they have to make 1.5 times that for every hour they work over 40 hours a week. And there's a lot of other laws. There's laws saying that employees need breaks certain times, saying that they can't be discriminated against based on like race or gender. There's a list of laws that apply to employees, and almost none of these laws apply to contractors. So if you hire somebody like a plumber, you contract with a plumber to fix your sink, you don't have to worry about, oh, is the plumber making a certain hourly rate, or what if they work more than 40 hours a week? And you don't have to worry about any of that because they're just a contractor. And so a lot of companies think it would be good to have more contractors and fewer employees so that there's less legal difficulties. And so some companies will just try to say, okay, this person is a contractor. But what courts have said is it's not that simple. You can't just call someone a contractor and make them a contractor. Courts have said there's really a difference between employees and contractors. Employees are people that the company has control over. And so the company trains them. The company tells them how to do their job. The company gives them equipment. The company really limits their behavior. And contractors are people who have more freedom. They might have multiple different employers. Like your plumber probably has thousands of people that he does plumbing for. They can set their own hours. You don't tell them exactly how to do the work. Like when the plumber comes, you're not like, oh, I have a specific method I want you to use. You're just letting him use his expertise. So there's like legal tests for what makes the difference between a contractor and an employee. And some people have argued that contract growers, so-called contract growers, are really just misclassified employees. So misclassifying is what it's called when a company calls somebody a contractor, but they're really treating them like an employee. And a court can later say, actually, you have to pay this person a whole bunch of money because you owe them all this overtime and stuff that you weren't giving them when you had them misclassified. So to back up, I think I need to tell people a little bit about how the chicken meat industry works, at least in the US, and I think in more and more other countries. So the way it works is there are these large companies that are called integrators, and examples would include Costco, which I mentioned, and Case Farms, which I mentioned. These big companies breed chickens, and then they send the chickens to lots of little factory farms all around the area. They have people truck chickens out to these factory farms. I'm saying little. They're not little. A factory farm might have, several 100,000 chickens at it.
Wow.
But it's little compared to how many animals the company in general has. So maybe the company slaughters 100 million or 200 million birds each year, and each individual factory farm would have a few 100,000 birds at it. And they don't call them factory farms. They will call them, I guess, just contract grower farms or grower farms or something else. So each of those farms is on land that's not owned by the big company. It's owned by some person or some family that is the grower. So an individual person will get a contract with a big integrator saying that the integrator will give the person a bunch of chickens, a bunch of money, and a bunch of food in exchange for that person growing the chickens from like a day or two old to slaughter weight. And then the company comes and picks up the chickens that the company owns and trucks them to slaughter at the end of the chicken's life. So these people, the growers, the way they buy the land is they usually need a loan from a bank. And to get the loan from the bank, they usually need to bring a copy of their contract that they have with the integrator to show, like, I'm good for the money because I have this contract with this integrator. And that's basically the whole system. I think I kind of explained it. I hope that makes sense. But the issue is that a lot of these integrators will make really strict rules about how the grower can behave. So they'll say, like, this land is acceptable to grow chickens on, this land isn't. And then they'll say, you need to build a factory farm that's to these exact specifications. And they'll say, like, exactly what it needs to be like. And they'll say, you need a feeder system that's like this. And you need a grower system that's like this. And they'll really, really tightly control every single step of the process. And so they're not just letting a contractor have multiple clients and do things the contractor's own way. They're really controlling the person's life like an employee. And so that's why some people believe that contract growers, so-called contract growers, are really misclassified employees. I think there's been one or maybe two court cases about it, and I don't think that I'm not aware of a resolution answering that legal question.
Okay, interesting. When you say you're not aware of a resolution answering it, it's an open question then?
That's what I believe, yes.
Wow. And presumably there's a lot of money at stake. If they were to get reclassified as employees, there's a lot of retrospective, now you've got to pay overtime for the last however many years. Yeah.
Yeah. It could be that I'm not up on the resolution to these cases, but the last I remember, there was one case that survived a motion to dismiss where the court said, like, what you're saying could be right, kind of like you can go forward to the stage of the case where you get more evidence.
Mm.
And I don't know what's happened after that. And I guess even if one court made a ruling on this, other courts in other states might disagree based on their state laws, or different integrators probably have different practices. So somebody might say, well, this integrator's practices are over the line, but this integrator's practices are like under the line. So it probably is going to be a complicated legal area for a while. But yeah.
Wow, okay. So that's definitely one area that there could be victories won, and another lever in the kind of legal battle landscape, I suppose. Bit of mixed metaphors there, but I think you know what I'm saying. Okay, cool. I think that's everything that I had written down to ask you about. We spoke about focusing on kind of tractable cases and where there's a bit of leverage in setting precedents for others, and how that is really more about sort of sending a message, right, or setting an example and saying there is an organization out there that's enforcing this stuff. You can't just do whatever you want with respect to farming animals. We spoke about the employees / contractors thing, the individual executives who are liable to not make their companies break the law, the ag-gag laws that are probably unconstitutional. Wow, we've covered a lot of good stuff. And also a bit about how investigators should approach investigations with a sort of legal mindset. So that's all really, really useful stuff, I think. Is there anything else while we're on that you would like to communicate, or that we didn't get to, or anything like that?
I just want to hit home that animal cruelty is a crime and no one is above the law.
Excellent. That's a good note to end on, I think. And really, thank you so much to you and all of your colleagues at Legal Impact for Chickens for actually enforcing it and being that voice, because, like I say, it doesn't happen automatically, and unless you guys are doing it, it doesn't get done. So it's really, really important, the work you guys are doing, and I hope that people continue to fund Legal Impact for Chickens generously. And thank you so much for coming on and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for your donation and for telling the world about Legal Impact for Chickens and for everything you do for animals.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate you.